Welcome back to New World Next Week, and lest there be any confusion, I am James Corbett of the Corbett Report.
And I am James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com. Trump doesn't need excuses to act vengefully, but this provides him one on a shiny silver platter. We have got that giant story for you, plus U.S. weapons for Syria. But first, South Korea lifts president's martial law decree after lawmakers vote against it. These are the good Koreans that are our friends, James. The president of South Korea early Wednesday lifted the martial law he imposed on the country hours earlier, bending to political pressure after a tense night in which troops surrounded parliament and lawmakers voted to reject military rule. I love when they do that. President Yoon Suk Yeol, who appeared likely to be impeached over his actions, imposed martial law late Tuesday out of frustration with the opposition, vowing to eliminate anti-state forces as he struggles against opponents who control parliament and that he accuses of sympathizing with communist North Korea. Remember, when you're losing, just knock over the game board. Police and military personnel were seen leaving the grounds of Parliament following the bipartisan vote to overrule the president, and the declaration was formally lifted around 4:30 a.m. during a cabinet meeting. Parliament acted swiftly after martial law was imposed, with National Assembly Speaker Woo Woon-shik declaring that the law was invalid and that lawmakers would protect democracy with the people. In all, martial law was in effect for just about 6 hours. President's surprising move harkened back to an era of authoritarian leaders that the country hasn't seen since the 1980s and was immediately denounced by the opposition and leader of Yoon's own Conservative Party. Lee Jae-myung, leader of the Liberal Democratic Party, holds the majority in the 300-seat parliament, said the party's lawmakers would remain in the assembly main hall until Yoon formally lifted his order, meaning, we're not going outside. Wu applauded how troops quickly left the assembly after the vote. Even with our unfortunate memories of military coups, our citizens have surely observed the events of today and saw the maturity of our military. While announcing his plan to lift martial law, Yoon continued to criticize Parliament's attempts to impeach key government officials and senior prosecutors. He said lawmakers had engaged in, quote, unscrupulous acts of legislative and budgetary manipulation that are paralyzing the functions of the state, end quote. Those sound like the regular functions of any state to me. South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol orders withdrawal of martial law troops, lifts martial law, and as was noted by many folks on the tweets, this sounds like a bad remake of the classic transitions to right-wing military dictatorship we saw in so many U.S. vassals during the Cold War. James, again, these are the good Koreans, right? Imagine if Kim tried this in North Korea.
Yeah, fair enough. But to be fair, isn't this what North Korea is? So
always does.
It's Korea reverting back to Korea. No, okay. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, intimate, detailed expert on South Korean politics, let alone deep state politics going on in South Korea. But this does appear, at first blush at any rate, to be what you're talking about, throwing over the game board because it looks like you're losing. But for the people who do see absolutely every event that takes place as some sort of fake and staged thing that isn't real and nothing ever actually happens in reality, you will be relieved to know that this is a completely fake and staged event that didn't happen in reality. At least according to the Twitterati, and I will direct you to Oliver Alexander, who has a post up. Most of the Korean SOF operators I saw at the National Assembly building had no magazines in their pistols, were carrying blue training magazines, and had simunition bolt carriers in their rifles. And you can look at the accompanying footage and come to your own conclusion about whether or not you think that is an accurate assessment of what we are seeing in those images. But let me put it this way. If this was some sort of deep state Illuminati operation, simulation, whatever, I'm not seeing the point of it, at least not at first glance, specifically because, as you say there, James, doesn't this seem like every transition to some right-wing military dictatorship we've ever seen? But this would be a transition away from the right-wing government, and a government that is very much on board with, at the very least, the U.S. deep state agenda. And I think Dave DeCamp does a good job of putting that in perspective in the anti-war article on this. South Korea's Yoon lifts martial law after night of turmoil, in which he notes Biden and Yoon have restarted major war games on the Korean peninsula, and the U.S. has deployed significant firepower to South Korea, locking into a cycle of tit-for-tat escalations with North Korea. And last year, In a major provocation, Biden sent a U.S. nuclear-armed submarine to dock in South Korea for the first time since 1981. A few months before the deployment, Biden hosted Yoon at the White House, and the two leaders announced steps to increase nuclear cooperation, meant to give Seoul a role in coordinating the use of U.S. nuclear weapons in the event of a conflict with Pyongyang. So Yoon has been 110% on board with the deep state military-industrial complex agenda, so I don't see why they would be trying to foist him out in some staged event or what have you. It just literally looks like an unpopular political puppet, realizing that he is the political birdcage liner that is due to be thrown out and trying to desperately to cling on to power. At least that's what it looks like. I am certainly open to more information becoming known on this subject, though, as it develops.
Plus, the South Korean president isn't looking good either. But, Dark Brandon, really, he just does not give a crap anymore. I mean, they were good buddies singing American Pie, at the White House a couple years ago. I ran across that today in the archives, James, so we'll have to include that in the show notes so you can see this president of South Korea, yes, singing the American classic American Pie at some muckety-muck White House get-together thing. Brandon making goofy faces in the background. Hey, it's media monarchy. Dude, did you see, you maybe heard me cover it in a morning show, Sara Duterte of the Philippines? In other sort of presidential intrigue, she said, hey, if I'm killed, she has orders on the books to whack all of her enemies, namely the president and his family. So that's how things are going on in the Philippines. That's how things are going on in South Korea. And again, weren't we just recently reporting? Hope everybody had a fantastic Thanksgiving break and are safe and awesome and striving forward in this world. Previously to that Thanksgiving break, we were just talking about how Peace Party President Brandon, Democrat, is using U.S. weapons for, our neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Furthermore, Dark Brandon don't care. U.S.-backed groups fight Syrian army as reignited conflict spreads. Reignited conflict spreads being part of many a headline lately. Fighters from a U.S.-backed, Kurdish-led coalition battled Syrian government forces in northeast Syria early on Tuesday, both sides said, opening a new front in President Bashar al-Assad's loss of Aleppo in the recent week due to sudden rebel advances. James, I was not up on this at all. Again, lots of things going on. Airstrikes also targeted Iran-backed militia groups supporting Syrian government forces in the strategically vital region, a security source in eastern Syria and a Syrian army source had said. Sources both blamed the airstrike on the U.S.-led military coalition which operates against the Islamic State in Syria and has a small detachment of American troops on the ground. Reuters couldn't independently confirm the foreign force was involved in strikes, and the coalition did not immediately respond to requests from the media because they're fighting wars. The fighting around a cluster of villages across the Euphrates River from regional capital Deir al-Zor complicates the military picture for Assad, whose forces were forced overnight on staunching a renewed rebel assault near Hama. H-A-M-A, not the plural Hamas, playing the Twilight language word game as well. Last week's rebel assault that captured Aleppo, Syria's largest city before the war, is the biggest offensive for years in a conflict whose front lines had been kind of frozen since 2020, and all the attention was, of course, for Ukraine and then, of course, Israel. The heaviest fighting this past Monday along the front line just north of Hama, another major Syrian city where several villages have changed hands repeatedly over recent days. An operations room for the rebel offensive in the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a war monitoring group, said on Tuesday rebels had again captured those villages. Two opposition sources said the rebels were making gains in the Hama countryside. Russian warplanes intensified airstrikes against rebels alongside government jets over recent days. Again, both sides had said. Syrian state media reported Syrian and Russia strikes in the northern Hama countryside. Rescue workers reported strikes targeting hospitals in Aleppo and Idlib, causing, of course, civilian deaths. Any sustained escalation in Syria risks further destabilizing a region already alight from wars in Gaza and Lebanon, where a truce, of course, between Israel and Hezbollah militant group last week took effect. The Syrian civil war that began hot in 2011 killed hundreds of thousands of people, drew in major powers, and sent millions of refugees, of course, across international borders. Assad has had the upper... And this article leaves out what I assume is the hand, because he's going to need it. Assad has the upper hand since receiving backing from Russia and Iran a decade ago, but that support has been challenged by devastating losses Israel inflicted on Iran's Hezbollah allies over the past 2 months. James, a couple of related. Of course, I've always got to throw in media jokes so we can laugh to not cry. U.S.-backed Kurdish militia withdraws from Aleppo in agreement with the HTS. That's coming from the Cradle.co, and our buddy Ryan Christian of TheLastAmericanVagabond.com has an interview with Vanessa Beeley, who I think each of us have interviewed as well. The truth about what's happening in Syria and new phases, old lies from global research, the new Syrian civil war. James.
Well, James, I think we are not going to be able to do justice to the unfolding events in Syria in just a few minutes here, so I will just throw in a confusing jumble of acronyms and geographical place names in here, and obviously provide the links so people can do more research for themselves. But I think one thing that we should be looking at is, for example, this thread from antiwar.com, US-backed Kurdish forces attack East Syrian village, which note that one of the players in this confusing puzzle is not just the Kurdish SDF, who have been attacking and temporarily claiming that they had captured 7 villages in the eastern Deir ez-Zor province of Syria, but also, of course, the US, who were supporting those SDF forces. And the US not only supported the SDF attack, but according to Al-Mayadeen, the US military actually instructed the SDF's Deir ez-Zor military council to attack those specific villages. And the US provided artillery support, firing artillery out of the Conoco outpost, which is near oil fields, which might give you one of the perspectives of one of the calculations, geostrategic calculations that's going on here. But just to follow up on that, we have this follow-up article from the next day from Antiwar. US frames Syria airstrikes as self-defense, despite happening amid an ongoing US-backed offensive, which notes not only that they had confirmed that the US had launched airstrikes in connection with that Kurdish SDF attack, but that these strikes were launched specifically while the SDF offensive was ongoing and targeted forces in the area of the attacks. The Pentagon, however, has tried to present their strikes as self-defense because, of course, well, there's things happening around our forces. It's like when they keep Russia keeps putting its territory closer and closer to our NATO bases. What's going on here? And okay, so that's one of the calculations going on here. Here's another one, this one from Robert Indelkesh, writing for Mint Press News, how the US and Israel quietly revived Al-Qaeda allies in Syria's Idlib offensive, putting some more of the history and background into this operation and what's going on there. We have this article, Russia accuses Ukraine of supporting Al-Qaeda-linked fighters in Syria, which notes that Russian ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, accused Ukraine of supporting militants in Syria, an accusation that comes a few days after the Kyiv Post reported that Islamist groups based in Idlib have received training from the Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, the GUR or HUR, depending how you acronym it. And it does go on to say that GUR has trained HTS militants on tactics developed during the Ukraine war, including the use of drones. And militants affiliated with the Turkestan Islamic Party, the TIP, under the command of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, have been using drones against targets in Syria. So we have, what do we have? HTS, TIP, we have the SDF, we have a number of other acronyms going on here. And let's kind of complicate things even a little bit further because, of course, well, why are the Russians there? And why are the Russians fighting some kind of, is this now a proxy war with Ukraine that's happening in Syria? Why are the Russians there in the first place? Because they love and care about the Syrian people. No, because they have their own geostrategic interests for being in the region. A point that's put quite well by the Liberum. I don't know how to pronounce that. It's a new site to me, but I am keeping my eye on it because they have a couple of good articles that I'll reference. One, Will Putin sacrifice Syria for Ukraine? Which talks about Russia's role. For example, it's I don't know how to pronounce that, Khmeimim Air Base in the Latakia area and their naval base in Tartus, which is geostrategically important for Russia. And as they note, this goes into the Turkish relations between Russia and Turkey, because to get the green light from Ankara, Putin may have to make concessions to his Turkish President Erdogan But that's not all. On their way through the Black Sea, if the Russians are forced to leave, Russian vessels would become an easy target for the Ukrainian military. They would need permission to even get through, to get back to Russian waters, etc., etc. So Russia's dealing with its own geostrategic headaches here, which is why they're saying, no, look, it's the Ukrainians. But, oh, by the way, this was all taking place literally hours after the Lebanon ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel. Suddenly, now there's this new attack in Syria that clearly has Israeli hands in it. And what about Turkey? Why is Turkey involved in this anyway? And don't they hate the Kurds? What's going on with that? And why would Turkey have a strategic interest? Well, that was a question that was at least raised in the Covert Action podcast that I was listening to recently. It's a bunch of tankies discussing this, so they come up with the rather unconvincing explanation that it's the capitalist class in Turkey. I don't think that's particularly the sum total of the deep state political calculus that's going on with Turkey's involvement in the region. But anyway, there is that. And finally, I'll direct people to another Liberum article, which is a good overview. Why Syria and why now? Which are good questions. And they come up with a list of all the people who are at the table and all the acronyms and what their various geostrategic incentives are. There's a lot. There's a lot of history. And if you've been following the Syria debacle for the past decade and a half almost, then you probably know some of these interests and who's at the table and why they're there. But there's a lot going on. At any rate, for whatever reason, at this time, Syria is back on the chessboard, and boy, oh boy, is everyone moving to put their pieces in place on that piece of the chessboard. So this is a developing story, and although, James, we have the New World Next Week sigh, and we have the New World Next Week laugh, I think we have to have the New World Next Week temporal disclaimer. And I can imagine Christopher Nolan's ears picking up at the idea. What? Temporal disclaimer? We should always point out, whatever we're saying, we're recording 24 hours before you see it. So whatever happens in the preceding 24 hours from when you saw this, we don't know about yet. But this is obviously a developing story that we need to be keeping our eye on. Lots and lots and lots of links for people who are interested in checking this out further.
James, and these dudes, I mean, Putin, Assad, Erdogan, these dudes are deeply entrenched in the deep state. They've been there for so long. There's so much connected and going on here. And one of the things that kind of jumped out at me was like, no, this was self-defense. That is the classic victim card being played by the aggressor, which I think was kind of one of the main reasons there was a big election upset here in the States about a month ago. And asking the question, why now? Something Cassie and I have been wondering a lot lately. It's become allowed for open protest of Israel to happen. I see the latest issue of Adbusters in the checkout stand at the hipster co-op grocery store yesterday, and there it is, Netanyahu's face, and it says, "You're anti-Semitic." I'm like, oh damn, we're allowed to. It's now suddenly been allowed, and I guess we're just really wondering, why has that switch... Can they not control it anymore? Or has the switch been pulled to allow college kids to get into the protests? James, did you see the Jewish cafe owner wearing the keffiyeh and a mask that did the Sieg Heil? Classic Zionist false flag to blame misdeeds on your political enemies. Again, a lot going on in the world, and we appreciate people taking a view of New World Next Week. We've been doing this show, James, 15 years now? And this is episode 573, a rather large story here in the States. They said it wasn't going to happen, but man, it did. Hunter Biden pardoned, and it gives Donald Trump the powerful new political cover. This is, I think, a pretty good thing from Politico. Pretty good in that it is written well and pointing out how the two-party system works, whether they intend to do that or not, James. AKA, one party loads the gun, the next party pulls the trigger. In his sweeping pardon of Hunter Biden, President Joe Biden did not just protect his son, he also handed President-elect Donald Trump a template to shield his own allies and stretch the pardon power even further, like all those great weapons and kills that Obama got after Bush pushed it for 8 years. Legal experts say Trump now has a fresh precedent and political cover to issue expansive pardons, absolving his allies not only of specific offenses, but even of undetermined crimes that they may have committed. With the singular exception of Warren Commission member Gerald Ford, who brought Cheney and Rumsfeld into the White House, and his pardon of Richard Nixon, No modern American president has ever issued such a broad grant of clemency until Joe Biden's full and unconditional pardon of his son on Sunday night, again, capping years of, you've seen the White House press secretary saying, no, we're never going to do this, no, again and again and again. The younger Biden is now effectively clear. This would be sweet. Cleared of legal consequences for any federal law he might have broken over a nearly 11-year period. And really, he gives crackheads a bad name, James. Those terms, so unusual, Politico writes, and the process leading to it so secretive, again, this coming from the Democrat Party that just shanked this dude in the front very recently, that the Justice Department's Office of the Pardon Attorney, I've never heard of before, which typically advises, on stuff like this, say they were not even talking to and were taken by surprise, according to a person who was granted anonymity because he doesn't want to get fired. In the final days of Trump's first term, at least one close ally, the controversial Matt Gaetz, who says he's not returning to Congress, acts like he's going to expose other corrupt members of Congress, which would be fantastic. This all according to congressional testimony. But top White House aides made clear the whole thing with Matt Gaetz was a non-starter. Now that Joe Biden has crossed the Rubicon, as Politico writes, legal experts and former Trump associates say it will be harder to restrain Trump next time. Next time meaning a month. He has now a ready-made rationale to follow when he returns to office. It certainly creates an acceptability for that model, said James Trusty, a former criminal defense lawyer for Trump. During the 2024 campaign, Trump pledged to harness the pardon power even more aggressively. Most notably, he promised to pardon many of the rioters who stormed the Capitol in his name on January 6, 2021. James, I'm also already holding my breath on the new FBI head to uncover all the undercover feds that were at the Capitol on January 6th. Again, that'd be pretty exciting. Almost immediately after the Hunter Biden pardon was announced, Trump hinted that he may cite it as justification for granting broad clemency to January 6 defendants. Ty Cobb, not the hated, racist, angry baseball player, but the White House lawyer during Trump's first term, who has since become a prominent Trump critic, said Trump doesn't really need excuses to act selfishly or vengefully, but this provides him one on a silver platter. And the current president's provocative pardon comes as congressional Democrats gird themselves for what all expect to be the next president's mission to expand executive unitary decider power. This was an improper use of power, said Senator Gary Peters, a Democrat of Michigan. It erodes our trust in government. Oh man, my trust in government's totally blown now. And it emboldens others to bend justice to suit their interests. One component of Trump's mission may be a blanket pardon of January 6 defendants shortly after he is inaugurated, and hopefully, lock him up. Maybe some hardcore jail time for Ray Fed Epps, who, James, I don't know if you saw this, a little bit of good news. Ray Epps lost his defamation case against Fox News recently. Tomorrow, he goes into the jail. Epps loses defamation case against Fox News as Dark Brandon pardons his son in a pretty unprecedented move here in the States, which I guess, we're getting used to unprecedented moves. James?
I guess so, but I will say that as the obligatory Canadian in Japan, what do I know? The one thing that I've always found weird about the American political system, the thing that always seems foreign to me is the idea of the presidential pardon. Like, okay, yes, you were convicted in a court of law for this crime, but the president said it's okay, so you're done. Like, it's such a weird concept. But anyway, yeah, it's one of those things. But I don't know. I mean, I guess it's fairly unprecedented, but didn't Bill Clinton pardon Roger Clinton Jr., his half-brother, for cocaine possession? Remember that?
For cocaine possession. Some dude who's kind of a loser brother doing cocaine, it feels a little different.
I'm not comparing the two in that. Yeah, I'm not comparing the two on the political level, but I'm just saying that pardoning your family seems like a tried and true American tradition. But then it's only the lefties that do this kind of. Oh wait, how about Bush pardoning Scooter? Well, commuting the sentence of Scooter Libby, and then Trump finishing the job, actually pardoning him officially when he was on the way out the door. So anyway, it's just a weird concept to me. I don't know why this exists. I think it's ridiculous, and it certainly does undermine trust in government, but whatever that's worth these days.
Again, you try and pull off crimes like this, and see how well it goes for you and your family, let alone multi-generations of your family being able to get away with it. It's this sneaky thing where they actually, I think it really shows, as the cliche has become, we should have to have our politicians wear the badges of who pays them so we know who's really in charge. It shows, I think, to me, who's really in charge of things, and it's certainly not the people that are allowed to go into a box every couple of years and, as you say, James, give their suggestion to Slavery Incorporated, no more apples. They do this. This is what they do. Right at the end, they'll kind of slip it all out, and again, it throws all of their other lies about this and freedom and blah, blah, blah. It throws it all in the face, I think, again, of a public who probably gets pretty disgusted of all of this. We'll put a pin in that. We can follow that up, James, on what will be only our last regular episode of the year coming up next week for New World Next Week. As we head towards the end of the year, of course, our big year-end episode will feature the only episode of the year where we don't know what the other's going to talk about. We each pick our story of this current year and try and pick a trend for the coming new year. James, I couldn't help it anymore. I had to go glance at what last year's discussions were, and as we were discussing before we started to get rolling, the idea of this sort of 365, 2460, there'll be a new mega news story, every 60 minutes at some point? And I tried to drag you into the United Healthcare CEO assassination story before we got rolling. Good googly moogly. If you didn't know, couldn't tell, we're all festooned with all the stuff. We run NewWorldNextWeek.com as not only a way to sell you organic, made-in-America goods that you feel good about wearing and good about supporting, and we feel good about selling it to you. You can also, of course, find the media from the kingdoms as well. Again, that keeps us fear-free, that keeps us ad-free. You've never seen us shill. You've never seen us run ads or commercials. And NewWorldNextWeek.com is a great way to support that, James. We had an apparel sale last weekend, and people bought tons of non-discounted media. We ran a Black Market Friday for black apparel, and we did pretty well selling, radio plays and USB drives. That's a good thing. That's just maybe more support heading to us at the New World Next Week World. Again, if you want to have stuff in ahead of Christmas time, giving the gift of truth and independent media, you should probably hop on that pretty soon. And as I always like to remind you, I get to play the exclusive audio of these New World Next Week episodes after my Thursday morning show. No one's heard it but me and James and Brock, and then you will as well. James, that is episode 573, buddy.
That's it, and it is getting cold over here, so I will put on my Corbett Report toque, which you can also get through the store with my Corbett Report shirt or the Corbett Report ball cap. Anyway, get your stuff ready for the New World next year, coming up in 2 weeks. I hope to see you again for another regular episode next week. Until then, James, thanks for the stories.
Thanks so much, buddy. Take care, man.